Thank you so much for coming out on a cold evening. We appreciate seeing all of you here. We're really excited for our conversation this evening. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm Sandra Navali. I'm the Managing Director and an adjunct at Columbia Business School, running the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise. So at Columbia Business School, we've had a long history of teaching leadership and management, often drawn from longitudinal research. About what works, what doesn't work in terms of leaders and managers in organizations. But often complementing that research are case studies drawn from real business leaders, managers, and the organizations that they run. It illustrates some of the insights and the strategies. And I think really excited for this conversation today because what we're going to be talking about is really drawn from that idea of examples from the social sector. The other thing I'd like to just mention is that while nonprofit organizations, we've seen from our teaching that what we teach at business schools is very relevant to people who are working and leading nonprofit organizations that are mission-driven. But equally, there's something to be learned for people going into the business sector about how organizations effectively pursue social innovation with mission and purpose. And so, I'm really thrilled to welcome our really very distinguished and luminary set of speakers today. Firstly, we're going to hear from David Schizer. He's both faculty member at Columbia Law School and the former Dean Emeritus of Columbia Law School, and new author of this book. So hopefully you all picked up your copy. We have extras if you would like to give them as gifts for friends. How to Save the World in 6 Not-So-Easy Steps, Bringing Out the Best in Nonprofits. This book, draws from the collective leadership of some really terrific organizations, nonprofit organizations for those of you that have your book, like on page 7 and 8, from organizations like Donors Choose, 92nd Street Y, Lincoln Center, NRDC, right? YMCA, like a lot of names that for those of you that are familiar with the nonprofit sector know. And I think David also draws on his own experiences as a leader of an educational institution, Columbia Law School, as well as his experience when he was at JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, I think over a century old, an international humanitarian organization doing some wonderful work. So first we'll hear from David before we ask our speakers to join us on the stage. But please join me in a very warm welcome to David.
Sandra, thank you, and thanks to the Tamer Center for arranging this wonderful evening for us. Thanks particularly to my colleagues on the panel. We have such an amazingly distinguished group today, and thanks to all of you for coming. So I do hope you enjoy the book, and of course the first question you might ask is, why did I write it? Why write this book? And the honest answer is that I have a love-hate relationship with nonprofits.
Stand this way, so that the camera can see you. Right, stand in front of the chairs,
okay.
Or at the podium.
Yep. So I don't know how many of you spend time with 2-year-olds, but what you'll find with 2-year-olds is they have to move all the time, and I'm exactly that way. So in any event, a love-hate relationship with nonprofits. It's 95% love, because I love the missions, but there's 5% that I find very frustrating, and the book is meant to help us all figure out what those problems are and how we can overcome them so that the mission can be achieved. But to make this a bit more concrete, I'll share a recollection with you. And Sandra mentioned I had the privilege of spending 3 years as the CEO of JDC. It's a humanitarian organization. They do work all over the world. And I think the thinking on the part of the board was it was good to bring someone from the outside. They knew that the mission was important. They were proud of what they did, but it might be useful try to see if there were things that could change, things that should change. So I had a lot of meetings, and I'm going to mention 2 of them. They're both with veterans of the organization, veterans at the time. So first meeting, I sit down, my new colleague says to me, David, I don't care about JDC at all, and neither should you. I knew there was more to the story. I sat there, I waited, and then he finished the point. He said, because what I care about is JDC's clients. I care about JDC's mission. And so, David, he said, you're coming in from the outside. you're going to see things that you think aren't quite right. Maybe even things you think are quite wrong. And it is possible that he said, it's possible that I'm the one who started or continued some of those things. So my point is, it's not that you have my permission to make these changes. It's that you have a moral obligation to make these changes, because I don't care about JDC at all. I care about JDC's clients. So to me, that really does sum up exactly the kind of spirit that I think we should bring to nonprofit organizations. But I told you there's another meeting, so I'll share that one too. So I sat down with a different colleague, and we spent an hour, and he went through the details of exactly how he does his job, and the topic sentence every 4 or 5 minutes was, and this is how we do things at JDC. And I listened. And then we had another meeting, and it was another hour, and it was exactly the same thing. This is how we do things at JDC, and in this situation, this is what I do. And in this situation, this is what I do. And in this situation, this is what I do. So at the end of this conversation, I said, I want to ask you a favor. It is so generous of you to share your extensive knowledge with me, and we both know how important it is for me to understand what the place does and how it works. But I suspect, given how long you've been here, I suspect that there are things that you find frustrating, maybe even things that you find annoying. And maybe you could share those with me. Maybe we could come up with a list together of things that aren't perfect, things that we might be able to change. And I can't promise we can do it, but I can certainly promise that together we could try. So I looked at his expression, and I kind of imagined sort of the way someone looks when you've sprouted a second head. And he said, I never thought about that. I said, okay. So he comes back for the third meeting, and we start the meeting, and he says, David, I know that you wanted me to tell you about the things that should change around here, but I'm just going to tell you how we do things. I kid you not. In any event, the point is people have different perspectives about nonprofits. And my point is the missions are great, and I love them, and I'm going to talk about that. But then there's this phenomenon that I just described. So, but what do I love about nonprofits? Well, the missions are amazing. We get to choose them. And there's something I want to highlight because I think it is unique and I think it's really, really amazing. And that is the autonomy. So if you think about democratic countries, there are things the government does well, there are things the government needs to do. But the government of democracies, it tends to be very responsive to the median voter. In a lot of cases, the median voter has a great perspective and it's constructive, but unfortunately, it is not true in many situations, right? It is the wrong place to try to innovate. It's the wrong place to try to come up with an idea that may seem a bit controversial now, but is really true and beautiful and is going to take over the world. And so just as a thought experiment, where did the civil rights movement begin in America? Did it begin in the government? No, it began in nonprofits. Black churches, NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So what about the women's rights movement? Where did that begin? In the government? No, right? Nonprofits. The environmental movement? Nonprofits. Gay rights movement? Nonprofits. And there's a reason. And the reason is people who are like-minded, who believe in something, can get together and do something that maybe they don't need the government's permission to do. And eventually, if it succeeds, you build support, the government takes it over. It's been true in each of the causes that I described. The government does get actively involved, but it didn't start there. So if you ask me, what do I love about nonprofits? That's at the top of the list. But what I want to emphasize is that autonomy, it has risks as well. There isn't quite the accountability that you might sometimes want. And this brings me back to my colleague who kind of liked things the way they were. So the truth is, at any organization, including in a for-profit business, there are people who like things the way they were. And they're very likely to tell you, well, this is the way it should be done, and it's working. But there's a difference. And the difference is that in the for-profit company, I might be the CEO. I'm telling you that it's working really well. But, Sandra might say, just tell us, how does the profitability look today? And it doesn't look so good, right? Like that I have to answer for that. So the challenge at nonprofits, and also their opportunity, is we don't care about profit. It's not what we're there to do. We're there to advance the mission. And that's the problem, and the opportunity. The opportunity is we love these missions. The problem is it's harder to measure progress. Now, don't hear me saying you can't do it. You absolutely can do it. But the challenge is that it is not as obvious. And when it's not as obvious, there are two issues, right? And one is familiar to everyone here. You could have the most capable, the most committed people leading the nonprofit, and it's still really hard, right? If you're a humanitarian organization, is it better to invest in vulnerable elderly people or in vulnerable young people? I submit to you that there are ways to think about that, but it is not obvious and it is not easy to come up with an answer, right? And even the most committed and the most capable people will struggle with it. But my point is, unfortunately, not everybody at nonprofits is as capable and committed as we might like. And sometimes when they have that discretion, they use it in self-interested ways, or at least in unwise ways. And then it's not as easy to monitor how they're doing because you can't just say, hey, how's the profitability today, right? So to me, that is the central problem at nonprofits, and it's what my book is about. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? So one possibility is it's hopeless and there's nothing to do. And if I thought that, then the book would be really short. It would be just the first 2 chapters, but the good news is it's not what I think. So I would say that successful nonprofits, they do 2 things really well. And this is hard. Each of them is hard. Doing them together is especially hard. But the first thing is they're rigorous and they're analytical in thinking about how to advance their mission. It's not just that they have a great mission. They do. It's that they keep thinking, well, but there are these 6 different ways tomorrow that we could try to advance it. And how do we know which is working? And maybe we should run some experiments, and maybe we figure out that these 2 are terrible and we stop those. This one's really promising, and so on. So they're analytical and they're data-driven and they look carefully and they try to figure out how do we advance the mission most successfully. That's one of the 2, right? That's the analytical component. But keep in mind, we might come up with the best possible idea, and it still wouldn't go anywhere without the second component, which is let's get everybody on board to do it. Right? And that's hard too, but it's more about advocacy than it is about analysis. So the 2 things are figure out the best way to advance your mission, get everybody on board to do it. And that includes the volunteers, that includes the professionals, it includes the funders. They all have to believe in it, they all have to go the extra mile to make it happen. So, very hard. What the book does is I suggest 6 different steps to try to operationalize that. For purely scientific reasons, they all begin with the letter P, so they're the 6 Ps, and you can read the book and see what they are. But I will just, because we have a really interesting conversation to come, I will just focus on 2 for a moment and give you a couple more anecdotes. So, the first of the Ps is plan. I am a great believer in planning processes, and I'll take you back to my first weeks at JDC and those conversations. I had other conversations, and the sense that I was getting from a lot of people was, 1, we love the mission, it's a very special mission, helping vulnerable people around the world. Wow, this is great stuff. I couldn't agree more. But they were also saying, kind of a lot of this stuff, and we don't know how it all fits together. And I started referring to that with colleagues as the bunch of stuff critique. It sort of meant that at least from the outside, we didn't seem like we had a tight, disciplined strategy which said this is what we do and why. Now, there was a good reason for that, and I should just tell you more about JDC. It has 10,000 employees. Budget is about $370 million a year. They work in almost 80 countries. None of the work is in North America. Almost none of the work is in North America. And the CEO is in North America. So what you have is you have a small headquarters, in theory, trying to manage a very big operation of people doing things all over the world. And that is a very appropriate recipe for delegation. But with delegation sometimes comes a lack of communication. Things kind of grow almost with archaeology instead of planning, well, we're doing this, let's add this and keep that there and so on. And so it seemed to me that what we needed was a more rigorous planning process. But the thing is, others had tried. And so I knew that if I tried to do this, I kind of had one chance to make a good impression with the right people, and if I messed it up, it was going to be harder to have credibility. So what did I do? There are about 10 people in the organization who each run really significant programs. And I needed to get them engaged in this effort, and what I decided to try first was decision-making criteria. So I had 10 different meetings, and at each of the meetings with each of these people, it was the same conversation. I said, hey, let's do a thought experiment together today. Let's imagine that we have two things that in principle we would love to do, but we can only do one of them. We only have money for one. How do we decide? What questions do we ask? Now, I should say, these are very impressive people. They were really thoughtful. I learned a lot in each of these conversations, and I was impressed by the fact that there really were common themes. And it's not that they had sort of done this together, it's that they thought about it in the same way because they were all rigorous and smart and committed. So what I did is I summarized all 10 conversations in one 2-page document, shared it with all of them. They were all coming to New York. I said, when you guys are here next week, we're all going to get together. We're going to spend 2 hours rewriting this summary because this summary is not good. You guys can do much better than this. And what I'm hoping we'll do at the end of this conversation is to have decision-making criteria that we can then share with colleagues and get their input about. And so we start this conversation, and I'm happy to say they were really excited by this topic, and they were debating with each other, and they were really getting into it. And I tend to test the quality of a meeting by how little I speak, and I said very little. And so by the end of this, we had 3 questions that we decided we would ask. And the good news is we did get a lot of buy-in from everybody else, and this is really what JDC does to this day. 3 questions are asked about everything the organization does. So what are these questions? It's really a proxy for social value, as you'll see. First question, how important is the problem we're trying to solve? After all, if it's not important, why would we do it? Second question, how effective is our response? Because even if we've figured out an incredibly important problem, we can't be effective in solving it, it's a waste also. Now those 2 questions, the problem, solution, they get you most of the way, but I'm a big fan of the third question, and it's a question I think is not asked often enough. Are we the right organization to do it? Because I tend to think there's a lot of mission creep. If other people are already doing it, probably shouldn't do it at all, or if you're going to do it, there has to be a theory about why you can do it differently and better than other groups do it. In any event, we have these 3 questions. This is plan. Another P is prioritize. It's applying these questions. And I will just finish with a thought about resources and fundraising. Because after all, you can't do anything unless you're going to get money for it. So my last P is partner. Partner is basically make the work of your donors as well as your work, include them in it so they feel ownership in it. There's an old story or an old saying that I'm sure you've heard. If you ask for money, you get advice. But if you ask for advice, you get money. I do think there's a lot to that. But I want to point out a potential tension between what I just said, the last 2 things I said, right? So you have to be really careful about what you do as an organization, pick the right things, be disciplined, and at the same time, you very much want your donors to feel invested and even to pick the things that they want to fund, and I'm a big fan of that. So there is something that we should guard against, and that is when we raise money, the program and the priorities have to drive the fundraising, not the other way around. I have a colleague from years ago who used to say it wasn't a priority before, but now that we have a gift, it's a priority. I think that's a terrible thing. So I will conclude with an anecdote to show that I am a believer in this. I was a new dean at Columbia Law School, happened to be a tax lawyer by training, and it's relevant to this story. So we have a graduate, he said he very much wanted to give me a gift. I said, wow, that's great. And he said, I have this yacht. It's appreciated in value, and I don't use it that much anymore. I don't even really want it, and so I'd like to contribute it to you. Well, for any of you who know the tax law, sort of the nitty-gritty, you will see a problem right away. And the problem is when people give you not money, but a thing, they want to deduct the fair market value, not what they paid for it. And if they're giving you stock in a company, that's automatic. But if they're giving you what's called a collectible, which is like a painting or a yacht, you only get the fair market value deduction if you give it to a charity that uses it in its mission. Which is why if you have an appreciated painting, you give it to a museum. They can display it. You don't give it to a soup kitchen. So the problem was, a yacht, I said to him, listen, I'm going to save you time. You're going to talk to your tax lawyer. You're going to hear the same thing. You'll just hear it from me now. We're the wrong charity to do this because you should give this to a maritime academy. And he said, no, that can't be right. I want to give it to you. Okay. Calls me the next day. He says, oh, actually, you were right. I knew I was right. Can't really give it to you unless you use it in a mission. So I have an idea, he said. Why don't I give it to you, and you can teach classes on the yacht? So some of you are the right age for this reference. Who has heard of or seen the show The Love Boat? So I was sort of thinking the law boat. You know, you could have episodes on this special episode. We'll have this. Anyway, we turned down that gift. It did not make sense for us because the point is the mission can't change to accommodate the fundraising. It has to be the other way around. Well, another of the P's is pivot, which is about running experiments. And one of my core case studies in the book is the 92nd Street Y. And we are so lucky to have the people who actually did the really exciting experiment that I'm hoping we'll talk about. So in a moment, I think we'll bring them up. Andrew, thank you. Okay.
So I might ask our speakers to come up and take their seats under their names.
I'm speaker.
And just to make sure you're turned on.
Always.
Okay. So, all right. Wow, those lights are bright. David, wanted to start with you and your book. I think I mentioned this when we talked after I'd read the book. Actually, the last chapter was really compelling. And if I was your editor, I would have said, you should have put that at the start of the book because it goes into a little bit about your personal story and history. Can you tell us a bit about your motivations for why this book and what drove you and inspired you to write this?
Thank you. So the truth is, a lot of my motivation in working for nonprofits is personal, and it has to do with my family. So person who looms very large for me is my paternal grandfather because we have the same name. He was David Schizer. He died 10 years before I was born. I was named for him. So I'll say a word about him. He was born in Western Ukraine in the very end of the 19th century. And very difficult circumstances there. His parents died when he was very young, disease. He was raised by his grandfather until his grandfather was lynched in a pogrom. He was about 17 at the time. He had two younger siblings. And so he became the adult who had to raise these two younger siblings at the age of 17. And I have to say, having raised two 17-year-olds with a 15-year-old on his way to being a 17-year-old, the idea of relying on someone at that age to be the adult is fairly terrifying to me. But in any event, that's not the end of the story. So the Russian Revolution is happening. It's a civil war in Western Ukraine. There are the Tsar's people, they're called the Whites, communists, the Reds, lots of bloodshed there. And there was a day when some of the counter-revolutionaries showed up in his neighborhood, and they did not immediately find any communists. And so their thought was, well, you know, I guess we should go ahead and kill some Jews, because we have some Jews here, including my grandfather. So he was literally lined up against the wall, about to be shot, when some communists showed up. They're all shooting at each other. He and the others slip away, and this was the moment when he figured out he really needed to get here and to take his siblings here. So he did that, and obviously I have his name, but pretty much nothing in my life tracks what happened to him. I do like to say that I also endured all kinds of sacrifice as a child, but it really is just because I like the New York Mets, and that has never been easy. So the point is, wouldn't it be great for me to be able to pay him back and the other people in my family who made that move, made my very comfortable life possible, but of course they're all gone. So point is, I should say, by the way, my grandfather went to Columbia Teachers College, was very proud of that, became a teacher for the rest of his life, so Columbia made a difference to him. My mom went to Barnard, Columbia Law School, so this place has meant a lot to me, and JDC did also, because it helps vulnerable people in positions like my grandfather. So the reason for me why nonprofits are so compelling is not just the general point that I love their missions generally, but because it really is an opportunity to do something that means a lot to me personally. And I'm sure that I'm not alone in this room in feeling that way.
Thank you. So one of the concepts you touched on in your book, pivot, which in business school language, we often talk about social innovation, right? The importance of innovating, especially in nonprofit organizations. So bringing Asha, Stu, and Henry into this conversation. Henry, can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for GivingTuesday? For those of you who know Henry's background, GivingTuesday as something that was started at 92nd Street Y. What was the connection between that idea and the mission of the organization you were running at the time?
So first, I just want to say how pleased I am to be here. And I've been in the nonprofit sector almost all my career, and there are a lot of books people have tried to write about what it really is like to be a nonprofit leader. And this is the book our sector has been waiting for. It really is just a terrific read, and practically is such a huge help to people who are trying to make a huge difference. So David, congratulations on the book. Let me take you back 10 years from where we are today. And 10 years ago, Stuart Ellman was not, as he is now, the king of all VC in New York. He was like a struggling VC guy making a difference and was the chair of the 92nd Street Y. Asha Curran over here was not, as she is now, the CEO of GivingTuesday, which is now in 100 countries around the world. She had begun in only the way the 92nd Street Y, which was to appoint a Catholic as the head of Jewish lectures. So she had been the head of Jewish lectures at the 92nd Street Y, and I had been hired by the 92nd Street Y, I thought because they were going to create a path for the future for me, but I realized soon afterwards they just wanted someone to point out when they talked about the future. So they would roll me out once in a while and say, whenever anyone wanted to talk about Twitter, they'd say, well, Henry will tell you what the future is going to be. And so we were in an organization then at not a senior level. So 92nd Street Y, no one was at a senior level. Asha and I were mid-management. Stuart was the quite new chair and probably the youngest chair of the 92nd Street Y we'd ever had. And we were thinking a lot about filling our time in one level because there was not a huge appetite at the time for innovation. There was not a lot of people in the organization saying you ought to be doing things, but we had a lot of ideas about how things could be different in that way that middle management and lower management people often do. The difference was we actually got to try some of them. So the reason we got to try them is we had people like Stuart and Lawrence Belfer who recognized that there were people who were kind of younger in their careers who wanted to do something new. And so we were trying lots of ideas, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. So we did a big series of films that Asha went and did at Harvard, which were trying very early on, actually, trying to think about how you would use YouTube to help with civil discord. We ran a big summit every year to try and bridge the technology world and the social good world, when the idea that those two things were on the same team, which seems very romantic now. And of course, we did GivingTuesday. So one of the things we did at the 92nd Street Y was to say, okay, there's these days which are all about commercialism, Black Friday, Cyber Monday. What about a GivingTuesday? What about if we created something that would not be about consumption, but a day when you'd reverse the trend, and rather than people buying themselves more waffle irons or televisions, instead, could we get people to give more to nonprofits? So that was the thesis, and it really was because we had the blessing from the top to try and experiment new things, and because nobody really cared. It wasn't like we were betting the farm on this. These were ideas that the original budget for GivingTuesday year one was $18,000. And we spent $17,000 on law fees, on legal fees, to persuade people that this was going to be okay. And we spent $1,000 on entertaining because Asha and I traveled around a lot to persuade people that 92nd Street Y, that GivingTuesday was a good idea. So that's where it all began. And it began because we had the power and the permission to try new things. And again, I think what's so important about David's book, is one of the things nonprofits need to do now is to give their teams the power to try new things, and that is so often rare.
Can you talk a little bit about the decision to, instead of branding GivingTuesday as a 92nd Street Y initiative, to allow this to be something that would be branded for the movement, right, for the nonprofit sector? I mean, often nonprofits want to claim credit for things, right? Whereas this is an interesting decision that you made at the organization to say, no, this is something for the movement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There were two really important things which took place. One was philosophical, and Asha's thinking was, she has this her concept, not mine, but I'll explain it. The concept of unbranding. You unbrand things. You take your brand off things to release them. So what the philosophical breakthrough was, we weren't going to brand it the 92nd Street Ys, because if we owned it, nobody else would. So that was the key from a design perspective. And along with the philosophy, you needed the politics. And the politics is where Stuart came in. Because I remember board members saying to us when Asha and I were presenting this is a really great idea. We're going to have this big giving day. Where's our logo going to be? Is the 92nd Street's logo going to be between Giving and Tuesday? Are we going to insist that anyone who does a Giving Tuesday campaign gives us credit for this campaign? And of course the answer was no, we're not. We're going to make it Giving Tuesday and people can do whatever they want with it around the world. And we had the political buy-in at the top of the organization, which gave us some air cover, and we had the philosophical belief that this was the way to scale something, and so it proved. I mean, I was seeing some content today from Giving Tuesday, from Giving Tuesday Nigeria, which is a very, very powerful campaign there. And the idea now that you have these campaigns in 100 countries, everyone has grabbed Giving Tuesday and made it their own, is I think a real testament to the original thinking, but also the original leadership.
And so
He's giving me a lot of credit, and all I was basically lazy, because having been a venture capitalist for a long time, I always believed that if you get the right CEO, get the right person running the organization, and give them the ability to succeed or fail, and that my job always as a VC was to support my CEOs, but not manage them, not tell them what to do, but let them run. So I knew with Henry and with Asha that I had such an amazing team and the ability to do this, that, Henry's like, dude, you were the best boss I ever had, because you called me, you're like, how's everything? I'm like, good. I'm like, you need any help? He's like, no. I'm like, great, move forward. And that was our meetings, and they were really fantastic. And I think we honestly moved the why further. I mean, we created Giving Tuesday, we created leadership, we created women's empowerment, we created innovation. I mean, we literally, I believe, moved the 92nd Street Y from being a local organization on the Upper East Side of New York to a much more international, by utilizing both technology and social networks, a much larger organization with the same physical footprint. So it was just, it was really fun for me to come here, because I don't know if you know the full history. So I brought David onto the board of the 92nd Street Y, because I literally had known him through my wife, who went to high school with David, as just the smartest man that has ever lived. And having gotten David on, and having Henry, that we became the head of the board, and Asha became the head of Giving Tuesday, it gave me the best possible leadership, which was do nothing, offer to help, and watch these great people run.
Can you talk a little bit about the board dynamics at that time of transition, right? To go from an organization that was really centered in New York to something where you're trying to build these bigger initiatives and be more experimental. Were there things going on at the board level that you had to kind of massage or manage?
Yes, I know it's hard to believe given my advanced age now, but I once was the young person on the board of the 92nd Street Y. So I've been a venture capitalist, so I was always the guy that they went to talk about what's going on in technology. So literally in like the year 2000, 2001, when they wanted to set up a website, I oversaw the committee that set up the website, right? I oversaw the committee that did this, the e-commerce, the everything. So whenever there was a new technology, they always like, oh, talk to Stuart. He's the tech guy in New York City. He's the venture capitalist. And that gave me a great sort of, place to look and pulpit to sit on when I got to do this, which was the world was just completely changing, right? So on the one hand, there's always going to be people that are arguing that first of all, the big argument when I became the head of the board was, are we local with some international things, or are we an international organization with some local roots, right? Because in the end, we didn't have the budget to do both, right? Like we could help the people, poor people on the Upper East Side, right? Or we could help people in Nigeria. And it was actually, we didn't have the budget or the manpower to do both. And sort of the great thing about working with Henry and Asha was, the idea that we could utilize technology to help more people to leverage, right? Not use technology as a vertical, but use technology as horizontal, right? Throughout everything we do, be able to get the widest possible net in the most capital efficient way and help the most people. So I feel like they did give me more leeway maybe than they would have given others, because I think they brought me on as the young guy to help move sort of in a technology-oriented fashion, which was in the early 2000s. And fortunately, I had the right people to help me do that, so it worked out very well.
Yeah. Asha, I mean, you were a co-creator from the start of this initiative. And if you could maybe condense the growth trajectory of GivingTuesday, it's quite unusual to see an initiative grow from within an organization and then be incubated and in some sense be launched into the world as an independent entity from a nonprofit. Can you talk a little bit about that growth path and then the trigger in which it became an independent organization?
Sure. Was my name?
Yes.
So I always think it's kind of funny when Henry and I are described as co-founders of GivingTuesday, because the truth is he was my boss and he told me to work on it. So I did, because he was my boss.
That was the founding moment.
It was the founding moment, and I don't think that we imagined anything like what it would be even in 2 years, let alone in now, going into our 11th year. And sort of Henry described where we were when it started. A few years later, I was running the WISE Innovation Lab, essentially, and working on a whole portfolio of projects, and GivingTuesday was just one of them. And it's really interesting that the conversation that we would have about if this thing keeps getting bigger, what will happen to it, at that point was actually, we'll just let it go. We'll just let it go, and it'll be just like Cyber Monday. It'll just, which was like a co-creation between some corporates and some, platforms and so forth. But over the years, as it grew and this incredible, comprehensive and ballooning community grew with it, it just became really clear that it wasn't Cyber Monday, because Cyber Monday has no greater vision. It has nothing that it wants to achieve in the world except to make a lot of money for a lot of retailers every year. And GivingTuesday was not that. It did have a bigger dream for the world. And so this was going into the 5th and 6th year. And actually, this is a very good governance story. It's a story about good governance. It's a story also about how important governance is. It was actually our funders at the Gates Foundation who started really prodding me to think about what the next step for GivingTuesday was. It's getting really big at this point. We're about 50, 60 countries. And they start making intimations like, we've been really funding you pretty robustly, but we're gonna have to, we're gonna have to think about that within the next couple of years. If it doesn't seem like there's gonna be a signal that you really intend for this to be a much, much bigger thing. And so I went through a very rigorous process of working with an outside firm who sort of outlined our various pathways. This was not like done capriciously in any way. And then they came back with a clear recommendation that we should spin out and be an independent organization. And there were other possibilities like moving to a more mission-aligned philanthropic organization and continue to be incubated or fiscally sponsored. The truth is I didn't want any of those, right? Because I really wanted to run the thing. And so once I had that recommendation, it was like a matter of really working closely with, not the full board, the 92nd Street Y has a huge board, but really the executive committee and the patron of my center, Lawrence Belfer, I was running the Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact. And there's obviously a lot of complicated operational and logistical things and legal things that go along with spinning something like this out, but also shockingly quite emotional and psychological as well. Like like emotions run deep around issues of ownership, especially in a big institution. But we worked together to get to the place where it was tenable, and it meant a lot of conversations. And it was really the executive committee's agreement that I needed, not the full board. And it was a process. But in the end, they let both me and GivingTuesday go. Because it was time for me to think about my next step anyway. But I really wanted to walk out the door with GivingTuesday under my arm, not leave it there, and that is what happened. And now Lawrence is on my board, so there remains just a really nice connection and relationship there.
And it's such a case study in a way, like this was always framed. Well, it wasn't always framed, but GivingTuesday very much became an idea about a generosity movement. That was the framing which Asha really began to lead around the world. This was more than just a transactional moment where you gave money, but actually a bigger idea. And the generosity which has flowed through this idea from the start, I've never seen anything like it, even with the WISE board, because the WISE board could have very easily said, look, this is a crown jewel, we want to keep it, it's going to be good for us, let's keep it and contain it and make sure we get credit for it. And they went the other direction. They realized that actually it would literally be for the good of the wider world if they would release this. And so it proved, because the GivingTuesday has now had very significant investments by Mackenzie Bezos and by the Gates Foundation and by other organizations, which never would have, I think, got it to the same scale. And just to dimensionalize it for you, I think Giving Tuesday is now $11 billion. Is that $11 billion raised in the US alone for nonprofits over the years, and it's in 100 countries around the world, and it's estimated to raise $4 billion this year in a world which has gone crazy. And for all of those numbers, which of course tell part of the story, the more important story isn't the numbers. As David pointed out earlier, businesses have it easy because they count one score, right? They count one score, and they don't even count that very well most of the time, which is have they made money or have they not. Nonprofits have a much harder challenge, which is actually you're trying to count what really matters. And so Giving Tuesday, easy to measure the numbers because they're impressive. But what's really important is the gestures of solidarity and caring and connection between people. So I saw a thing on the Giving Tuesday. There's a WhatsApp group of all the Giving Tuesday leaders around the world, all 100 of them in, 50 different languages. It's some incredible group of languages who speak to each other every single day. And there was a thing where they're building a health center in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there's a Giving Tuesday health center in there's no money involved. It's a community project. They're building this women's health center. And on the top of this health center in the DRC is a Giving Tuesday flag. Just think for a moment about an idea that began 10 years ago, an Upper East Side Jewish organization, which then ends up on top of the flag, the same logo we created back then, ends up on top of a health center in DRC. It's an incredible story of generosity, of ownership, to the point Asha made earlier.
But the ownership goes back to, should we brand it 92nd Street Y, or should we just brand it Giving Tuesday, right? And I think, what we all thought was that the movement itself would be truncated if it was Giving Tuesday by the 92nd Street Y.
Died on the vine.
Right, it never would have, just never would have gotten, I mean, the original thought is it never would really catch on or get any scale. So, I mean, I think from a business perspective, it was the right decision not to brand it, but you're right, there were certainly people asking, this is ours, we funded this, we created this, why aren't we getting credit for this? And the credit is something that comes from having been the place that incubated something that's very special, that grew to a point that it never could have grown if we had burdened it with the additional nomenclature.
Yeah, and I think it was really catching the wave of things that were going to become very, very obvious within a period of a few years, right? We talk a lot in my team about how the thing that defeats nonprofits over and over again is logos and egos, right? They often move to the front burner and the mission is just like somewhere back there, right? So we often talk about mission over brand as being something that we really advise nonprofits about. But I do want to stress something about the money, and I'm usually the first one to say that the money is sort of the least of what happens. But that's an extraordinary amount of money, and it's really relevant to how nonprofits are doing right now, because the amount of money donated on any Giving Tuesday in the last 6 years exceeds that money dispersed by almost any major US foundation in an entire calendar year. And that's money that's given just by regular people like you and me. And what we're seeing now is these really alarming declining rates in donor participation and an over-reliance on high net worth donors on the part of nonprofits. And I think when you look at that incredible dollar number, what you need to see is the incredible power that regular people can have when they act collectively, and how important it is for the vast majority of nonprofits to really be understanding how to engage regular people and have a broad and diversified base of supporters for sustainability and resilience.
Asha, can you talk a little bit about the tension between, Giving Tuesday as a concept and easily understandable brand versus allowing people in, 100 countries to be able to customize it to, their context and their organizations? Like, how do you strike that right balance between the two?
I don't find it to be a tension at all. I find it to be the two principles just work in total harmony. If we didn't let all of these countries and communities do what they wanted and have agency and autonomy, they would just be volunteers, right? And they would have the same retention rates as volunteers do, and they would feel like they're working for us. But they don't, because they have all of the agency and autonomy that they could wish for, and that makes them feel like owners, right? So the people in DRC are not running an American export. They're running Giving Tuesday DRC. And what they're doing with the banner is signaling that they are engaging in community-led change in solidarity with everybody else in the world who's doing that. And that's what's so powerful about that, and I wouldn't trade that part of it for the world. And then the organization that I run is a traditional nonprofit in most ways. We have a board of directors, we have a leadership team, all of that stuff. And we exist to amplify the work and uplift the work and support the work of all of those hundreds of leaders whose structure is completely lateral. So it's a mixture of models that I really hope will be replicated, because instead of saying institutions are better or movements are better, which I hear this stupid argument all the time, there's great things about institutions, necessary things, and there's incredible dynamics about movements. And if you take the best of both of those things and try to create new models out of them, I have to believe that that's where we're really going to start seeing missions being met in incredibly new, adventurous, and innovative ways. If you could substitute anything for generosity and still build a model that is replicated on ours.
So David, I think in your book you talk about the importance of transparency and communicating, what is the program, the strategies that the organization is pursuing, and also in terms of movement building, right, as to what Asha is saying, that communication being so key and critical. So what advice would you give to people based on all the interviews that you did, both with our speakers, but other people in the book, about how to do that communication effectively and consistently?
So I think it must be clear to all of you, and I'll just say the obvious, what these three folks produced is so rare, and it is so impressive. And the idea is missions can sound wonderful, right? We could define 50 different causes that sound great in the next 5 minutes. It wouldn't be hard. But the real question is, what can you do with it, right? Can you deliver it? Can you actually translate it from a nice idea to real powerful impact that changes people's lives? And obviously, this is a story where it happened. But what I was saying before is, unfortunately, it isn't universal. You could even say it isn't common enough, and that there are these barriers. There are these ideas, people get too enamored of the way they've done things before, and they're not adventurous, and they're risk averse. Maybe they're doing it because it's easy, it's good for them. And so what do we do about that? And my own opinion is that transparency is really the core of the solution. Because it's one thing for me as an advocate of a nonprofit to say, listen to these nice adjectives and listen to what we're going to do. But what you really want to know is, well, what have you done? And what specifically can you show me that proves to me that it's really working? And how do I know that what you're doing is maybe more efficient than the other things you could do? And to me, the answer to that really is disclosure. And so one of the things that I did at JDC that I thought was really quite successful is those 3 questions that I mentioned before. Well, they were not only the center of our planning process, but we then put out a document every year. And each year it was very different because our strategy was different, but it was called JDC's Global Strategy for Programs. And we would ask and answer those 3 questions about all the things that we did. And it turned out that this had a couple of benefits. One was we actually started raising more money because there were people out there who said the mission sounds great, but we just want to be sure that this works. And they could read the document, and we had data, and we had experiments we'd run, and I think it gave people real confidence. The other thing that helped a lot is, as I said, we were a spread out organization. It's kind of important that we all know what we were trying to do. And so we wrote the document together, and we kind of ended up treating it a bit as an internal contract. Well, this is what we said we were going to try to do, right? How's it going? And I think particularly when busy people can kind of disperse in different directions, having that kind of focus can really help. But at the end of the day, for me, it was especially about accountability. Were we really delivering what we were supposed to do? And I know it motivated me, and I think it motivated colleagues to know that we were going to tell people the details of the results, and we wanted them to be good.
So Henry, I mean, you've run multiple organizations. Going back to 92nd Street Y, there was something that David wrote about in the book of how you communicated the vision and mission of 92nd Street Y, which became a touch point. And it was this term to be joyful, healthy, and T-shaped, which when I first read it, I was like, what does that mean? And how did that phrasing come about and draw on the culture and the understanding of the people at the organization?
I think one of the things you're always trying to do, any organization is, leadership is describing a journey, right? Or your job is to give people some kind of journey, give some kind of narrative and help explain it. And the truth is people don't pay attention to much, right? So one of the keys to leadership, in my view, is to give people one thing which has 3 elements to think about all day. Because you can write all these papers, and we've all seen them and read them, and the 16-page strategy and the 2-page objectives and the things you stick on the wall, which always says authenticity and empathy, and people always forget what they are. What people remember is 3 things. So any organization I've run, you've had 3 things you're supposed to be doing, and we say it every single day until we've done them, and then we change them. So the ones at the Y were, when we were running GivingTuesday, Asha and I were both kind of middle management. GivingTuesday went very well. We set up this innovation center. She became head of innovation. I became president. So our careers both took off in a way because of this. And so when I became president then, we came through a difficult period. And the things I wanted the Y to be focused on every day were joyful. We'd lost the joy in our work. We'd had some really, really serious challenges. So we had to kind of recover the joy. Healthy, like our organization had not been healthy. Financially, it hadn't been healthy. Culturally, it hadn't been healthy. So I wanted people thinking every day about healthy. And then T-shaped was the idea that we would have the local and the global, the argument Stuart mentioned, we try and resolve it. So rather than local versus global, we'd say, okay, we're going to be T-shaped. We're going to have a deep stem, which is our local work, and we're going to have a wide top of the T, which takes us out globally. So it was my attempt to say no more argument about local versus global. We're going to be the best of both worlds. And I realized that was working was because I walked past someone's desk and they'd written on a Post-it note in pink, joyful, healthy, T-shaped, as a reminder of what they were going to do. When I started 5 years ago at Lincoln Center, the first day we had a staff meeting in a room like this. I said, we're going to do 3 things. We're going to build David Geffen Hall, which had been a problem for, not the other one, not this one.
Not this one. Exactly.
Which was some brand confusion for New York City by having 2 David Geffen Halls. But we were going to build David Geffen Hall, we were going to fix the finances, and we were going to invest in DEI. Those were the 3 things we were going to do. So Geffen Hall, finances, DEI. And we said that every day for 5 years until the hall was built, the finances were fixed, and we made a very big stride forward on DEI. So I always think that David's Ps was so useful. The idea of actually at the end of all of the Ps, you have to explain what these things are. You have to tell people what it is you're doing, and we make it far too complicated. So I'm a big believer in just do 3 things and keep talking about it till they're done. And even now, my team keeps saying to me, Henry, you talk about this too often, and I don't think you can talk about it often enough, because there is not a single member of my team who doesn't know what we're trying to do.
I mean, turning to our most recent crisis through the pandemic and your leadership at Lincoln Center during that time, there were some really interesting dynamics that we read about from the press about what was going on. Can you talk about your communication, that, whether it was the 3 principles or whatever, to mobilize so many different stakeholders, the different boards, your board, and the people at the organization? What do you think was different around the pandemic and that period of crisis that made your communication as a leader different?
We have an amazing team at Lincoln Center. An incredible executive team particularly. And something from Stuart's world, which is interesting, a lot of VCs will always tell you, don't go where everyone else is going. You're always looking for the person who's going in a different direction. So at the start of the pandemic, I was very focused on the idea of everyone, for good reasons, everyone was selling fear. Right, this is a disaster, we need an emergency campaign, we've run out of money, we're going to close our doors, and there were some huge problems. But I was very much thinking, okay, there won't be very many people selling hope. There won't be many people thinking, okay, I'm going to give you a vision, which is actually there will be a brighter day on the other side of all this. So we kind of shut down for 6 months because everybody did, because it was a time to focus on the critical issues of the city during the lockdown and health workers. But then we realized once we started to open up, we had a big role to play. So we did a couple of things. One, we built Lincoln Center outdoors. So Lincoln Center is 10 organizations, 30 stages, millions of people a year. But we couldn't be inside, but we had all this outdoor space. So we built 10 outdoor stages, so we flipped Lincoln Center inside out, which meant that we could have 70 organizations rehearsing and performing, and we could have New Yorkers there all day long every day. So we ended up creating this huge outdoor festival, which really brought the city together, including food banks and blood banks and voter registration and all these things we hadn't done before. And then the second thing we saw was that we've been struggling with this building project with David Geffen Hall. And we realized that if we actually accelerated the building project, it was a $550 million project, if we could accelerate it, we could actually build through the pandemic. So we hadn't raised the money, we didn't have the financing, we didn't have a vaccine, and the board of directors signed off on us building through the pandemic with the promise, it wasn't a promise, it was a hope, the hope that if we do this now, we'll create jobs for the city when the city needs jobs. We'll create a symbol of hope. And then by the time we get to the other side of this critical period, there'll be this beautiful new hall ready for New York. And so it proved. And we opened the doors of that David Geffen Hall 10 days after we took off our masks for the first time. So it's an incredible thing. 7,000 jobs created for the city, 42% minority and women business enterprises. And so what I think we got right during that, we got some things wrong, but we got most of it right. And it was because I think people were prepared to tell a different story, and we had an absolute clarity of vision. Like, I know it sounds like I'm simplifying things, and I am, but you have to make it simple. Your job as a leader is to simplify, because people don't do well with complexity, and it's getting worse now, not better, because we have so much data in our lives. We're all distracted so easily. We're all very reasonably distracted by the chaos and the anger and the awfulness of the world. So the simplicity seems to me the key of what we're trying to do.
Echoing just what Henry said, Asha, when you think about fundraising and nonprofits building a narrative about what they're trying to do, that importance of storytelling, have you seen some examples that you can share or principles about how nonprofits do that really well to tell their story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the moment that we're in, which our data indicates that generosity and giving are robust, except giving to nonprofits. And I often hear this described in the sector as a generosity crisis, which drives me bananas, because people have not suddenly given up the value of generosity. They didn't just suddenly not have that anymore. They do have it, and they're helping their neighbors, and they're helping their friends, and they're crowdfunding, and they're doing mutual aid, etc. I think that's a signal that we need to look inward and not blame the people for suddenly being less generous. And I think this issue of engagement is really the one. So like I think that a lot of nonprofits are stuck in the storytelling era of when the person you were engaging was a middle-aged guy who was going to sit down and write a check to the same nonprofit at his mahogany desk on December 31st every year. And the younger generations, I think there's now 2 younger generations younger than me, they don't think like that, right? They think in collectivity, they think in movements, they think in coalition building. They don't think in logos. So we actually did a storytelling contest called My Giving Story years ago, and we got thousands and thousands of submissions. It was funded by the Gates Foundation. And then a few years later, as we were spinning up our data work, we did a natural language processing analysis of all of those stories and what worked and what didn't. And some of the results were completely unsurprising, like if you put a puppy or a baby in your story, it's going to increase engagement, even if your story has absolutely nothing to do with puppies or babies. Okay, that's pretty predictable. That the best stories, the winning stories, had a classic Shakespearean arc, and that any story where a logo was included was negative correlated with engagement. So I think that when it comes to storytelling, there just needs to be like a wholesale modernization of the way nonprofits think about what engages people, and engaging them where they are, knowing that people don't want to just write a check now, giving them other opportunities to engage other than money, remembering that maybe somebody right now doesn't have any money to give you, but you engage them in your cause, and at some point they will, right? So you're making them a champion, an ambassador, and the campaigns that we see that do the best are, again, the ones that put mission over brand by banding together and telling a larger story. And the first time we saw that happen was with GivingTuesday, which was just one of the many fun ways that people played with the name of GivingTuesday. And it began because this small zoo in Florida decided to do this kind of welcoming, open source storytelling campaign about why zoos are important to our economies and our children and our wildlife preservation and so forth. And they welcomed any accredited zoo in the United States to join. Since then, we've just seen those ballooning and ballooning and ballooning. So now there's GivingTuesday for domestic violence, there's Latinos Give, there's Give Black, there's Native Give. It just goes on and on and on. Coalitions based around cause, culture, or identity, those work. Those engage people. So what's working on the giving side, right, is collective giving. GivingTuesday is working, giving circles are working, mutual aid is working, and moments of disaster pull people together, right? Anything that rallies people around a shared experience really works. So taking advantage of all of those, but also understanding that urge that people have, that need to feel part of something bigger than themselves, make that part of the story.
Can you talk a little bit about that nature and dynamic and shifting of what works well in fundraising and how you think that impacts innovation in nonprofits? Both, not just innovative fundraising, but also the core innovation of their mission.
Yeah, I like David, I have a love-hate relationship with the nonprofit sector, but it is more love than hate, and I want us to be introspective so that we can do better. So to preface what I'm about to say with that, we're seeing record levels of fundraiser burnout right now, huge turnover in the fundraising part of the sector. Many nonprofits sitting back and not making the asks that they should be making. In the pandemic, it was because they thought that what they were doing wasn't relevant, that they should stop fundraising and make way for first responding organizations to do their fundraising, where we're really encouraging people to step forward and really make the case, right? So we have just been seeing more and more nonprofits just sitting it out. And if they sit out long enough, they're just gonna close, right? I do think that nonprofits are not incentivized to innovate, which is really part of the amazing thing that was happening at the 92nd Street Y too, right? And I think that we have to shift some of the responsibility to that to funders. Because if nonprofits are used to thinking about 4 months cash on hand, right? Making payroll, constantly begging for money, it puts nonprofits in a starvation cycle that leads to scarcity mindset, and scarcity mindset will never lead to innovation, right? So on the funding side, like the calls for bigger grants, multi-year, general operating, trust the leadership team, right? Don't make them project-based, all of that stuff. All of that is right, because that's giving permission to that leadership team to really try to dream big. And what Mackenzie Scott did was special in the sense, not just that it was these big unexpected gifts, I got one, it's amazing, but that what happens in the time period after that is that you can breathe, right? Stop worrying about where that next gift is going to come from all the time, and you really just focus on what amazing things you can do with some of that money. But it hasn't been that a lot of the philanthropists have fallen over the
And maybe Stu and Henry, from what you've seen on the boards that you've been involved in, are there things that boards can do to put in place incentives or measures or culture of the board to help encourage, more innovation in their organizations?
I mean, I think a lot of it's just not forgetting what technology taught us about the long tail, right? So like there's the long tail of many small givers, and then there are the couple of large donors, right? And I think the world really got used to, like you said, December 31st, some guy sitting at a mahogany desk, the large donors. But, technology showed us that it's the small users that create the movements and that they add up, like GivingTuesday did, to a much larger, aggregate amount to be had. And I just feel like, it goes back to what David said, which is asking for advice rather than asking for money, right? I mean, when you want to get involved in a nonprofit, you want to get, the first thing I always want is somebody to say, my first thing is, what can I do? Like, how can I help? The last thing I want to do is just have somebody say, can I have some money? Right? Because it's just meaningless, right? It's the mission. It's, a lot of people will have, I remember when I started at the 92nd Street Y, I didn't actually have very much money. And I became super involved with the organization and started running all these various things and running all these centers and ran the first center that Henry got hired to do. And to me, that's just so much more meaningful. I just feel like we have to, the people on the boards of a lot of the institutions now, when you're in your 50s and 60s, you're not understanding a lot of the movements that are happening and that are changing the way people think, and how technology has changed the way people think, and how the long tail has changed the way people think. So I think the best thing to do is to bring on people that are young enough to understand where the world is going. And even though they might not have any money to give right now, that's the least important part of it. It's what can they give you out of their skills and interest.
I'll give you a practical example. I think often generosity becomes strategy. And what I mean by that is what you can do as a philanthropist is actually make a gift which does influence where you're going to go as an organization. So I told you a story earlier about when I started at Lincoln Center. priority 3 was DEI. And so this was pre-pandemic, this was pre the murder of George Floyd. Fair to say Lincoln Center had not made DEI a priority before. Easy for me to say as a chief executive, but actually Sandy and Tony Tamer, who of course have launched the Tamer Center here at Columbia. Tony's on the board, Sandy's a close friend of ours. They made a gift in my first 6 months as president. I've started as new president. I've said DEI is going to be a priority. They made a multi-million-dollar gift to support new experimental initiatives around DEI in the arts. And that seems to me the perfect example of the kind of way in which at board level you can make a real difference, which is you can look at this and think, okay, strategically they're going in this direction. There's a danger here. This is all going to be vaporware. This is the kind of thing that organizations say and then don't do, as David pointed out earlier. And then I'm going to use my capital to reinforce a strategy and to support leadership and then to step back. And I think that's the other thing which Asha touched on and so did David, which is this idea that philanthropy is not a license to bother nonprofit leaders. That isn't what should be happening, right? Philanthropy should be an opportunity to actually inspire people, to trust people. And Stuart was the best boss I had because he trusted me as a leader entirely. He let me get on with it. When I screwed up, I called him, and I always did. It wasn't like we weren't talking. When I needed support, he was always there for me. But it's that idea that actually nonprofits need to be trusted and cherished. They don't need to be micromanaged, and they don't need to be pushed into doing things they shouldn't be doing because we don't need to be on yachts, which I thought was a very good point, David. Keep away from the yachts.
Keep away from yachts.
Keep away from yachts. Unless it's maritime science, which I think is great.
I want to make something explicit, which I think each of you have said, and it's really important. So part of the way we innovate, whether it's in venture capital or in nonprofits, is we try things, and a lot of them are going to fail. And so I think a key point is to have the right kind of wise donors who understand that actually failure is part of the process. And if you just think about it, if each of us in our lives is succeeding at absolutely everything that we try, then I think we know that we're not trying things that are hard enough, right? And the same is true with nonprofits. We need to strike a balance because on one hand, I'm less trusting as a person than I think you folks are, and I don't know about complete trust. I kind of want to have a sense of how people want to get something done and why that way as opposed to another way. I can be really annoying, by the way. I think you could probably tell that. But at the same time, it mustn't be the case that people are afraid to fail because then they're going to be too cautious and we're not going to get the really big wins.
So I have a couple more questions, but I want to encourage the audience to think about questions because we'll have some mics coming up and down the stairs for you to ask. Can we maybe pivot to the current crisis that is happening around the world? Thoughts about advice for people leading nonprofit organizations, educational institutions, about what, from your experience, you've seen work in trying to manage through crises?
I'll give you a starting point, which is I think one of the key priorities for all nonprofits now is mental health of your own staff. And actually, I certainly think it's a real challenge. We see it on university campuses too, of course. We see it everywhere, which is you've got these organizations who essentially were not set up. Most nonprofits have pretty basic HR functions. I mean, in some worse than basic, but they don't have, on the whole, very sophisticated, because they don't have the money to do it, very sophisticated people departments or culture departments. True often of Columbia, of course, is a university with significant resources and can invest more in mental health, but many universities don't have that opportunity. So you've got a lot of organizations, I think, right now whose leadership, like Asha said about the fundraising community, whose leadership, whose faculty, whose teachers, whose students are all feeling significant anxiety in their own lives. So I think the first step is actually to look in, to think about, okay, what can we be doing more to provide support for our people and our community at times of challenge? Not easy. Right? And especially not easy because none of us were set up to do this. Right? If you think about it, we were all set up to do a good enough job of hitting payroll, and if there's a problem with staff, we can deal with the staff. But we haven't been set up to essentially provide social service opportunities for our team. So I think we're spending a lot of time now at Lincoln Center on exactly that topic, which is okay, what can we do more to support our staff? So I think that's a really good place to start.
I want to just add to that, just because when you think about the people that are in college right now, right? They were a couple of years old when the first world financial crisis hit. A lot of parents lost their jobs. People lost their houses, were pulled out of school, right? They were in high school when we had the pandemic. They were pulled from their classes, right? They were, sat in their house for, 2 or 3 years. They show up to college, and what happens? There's almost a world war happening. I used to think, my parents' generation, I know David's, they were the Depression kids, right? They had lived through it all, lived through Depression, lived through World War. But the mental health needs of people between the ages of 18 and 22 is just, it's dramatic. These kids have lived through a lot. They've gone through more than, I could have imagined growing up in the time that I grew up. And you're right, Columbia is a wealthy university and can afford to do it. But, everybody needs access to some mental health issues, because it's been very hard for people. Like I had one kid in high school during the pandemic, another kid in college during the pandemic, and it was unbelievably difficult to watch them both go through this. I mean, they went through stuff that I couldn't believe people in their teenage years had to go to. And this stuff leaves scars, right? I mean, trauma leaves scars, and you have to deal with it at some point. So I absolutely agree with Henry. It's number one is making sure people are healthy and can talk and understand and aren't living in fear and aren't fearful of going outside and aren't fearful of being who they are.
So I will agree with all of that and generalize it in a way. I have the privilege, being a member of the faculty, of spending a lot of time with students who are having a hard time. And I want to just make a more general point about them, about myself, about institutions. And that is this real challenge in life between being directive and reactive. And I'll just take you back to when I was a brand new young dean, and it is relevant even if it doesn't sound relevant. My first few weeks kind of felt a lot of satisfaction. I was getting an enormous number of emails. And if I answered them all, so I thought, wow, I've done my job today. And about a month into it, I realized actually I wasn't doing my job. I wouldn't say at all. I was doing some of my job, but a piece of it, because what we have to do as individuals and what institutions have to do is have priorities. These are things where we have to make progress, even if the world is distracting us, right? And so there's what I would call a directive, part of whether it's leadership for an institution or frankly just the lives that each of us live as individuals. These are things that are so important that I have to get done. I have to make progress on them. But at the same time, sometimes the world really changes and the things that you thought were the priorities, maybe they aren't exactly the priorities anymore. Maybe you have to be flexible about that. And so you can really go wrong if you tune out the world too much, but you can also go wrong if you're completely responsive to what's going on and you don't remember what you have to do. And so I think that's true generally, but I think in a time of a crisis for an institution, it's really hard.
Okay, so my last question before we open it up to the audience is, we have a mix of people in this audience who, some are students who are thinking about careers in the nonprofit sector. Others might be heading to business and thinking about giving back in terms of board service, philanthropy, volunteering. Advice for, given that we have cross-sector switches, we have, people who've led organizations, advice for people in this audience about how they might think about their career or beyond their career to have the biggest impact for the world.
I think that one of the reasons these two guys have been amongst the most successful nonprofit people is because they run nonprofits like they run a startup, right? It's the taking risks, not being afraid to fail, not being afraid to push back against bureaucracy. I mean, for the longest time, nonprofits were very, very bureaucratic animals, right? They were run by people who'd been in the organization for 30 years, had grown up steeped in that way of doing it. What you're talking about in terms of failure was very relevant. I taught at Columbia Business School for 15 years, and I always ended my class by telling the students they needed to risk failure and not be afraid to fail. There aren't a lot of people that were in nonprofits for 20 and 30 years that have ever actually failed at anything, right? Henry and Asha took a different perspective, a much more aggressive perspective, and a perspective of we're going to try and do great things. We're going to break some things, and we might fail. But that's what really, I believe, has pushed the whole innovation of nonprofits forward. And I feel like that's what the next generation has to continue doing as well.
So I will add that one of the pleasures of being a dean is you get to introduce a lot of people. And you usually recite their bio. And when you do that, it's kind of a backward-looking exercise, it all seems like a plan. It all seems like each thing beautifully led to the next. But the truth is, it's never planned, right? People don't know when they're in school exactly where they're going to end up. And so then the question is, so what does it take actually to be one of these successful people where people maybe even think it was planned, even though it wasn't? And I think it's two things. I think one thing is you are incredibly lucky if you can find things that you love to do. And the good news is there's just a lot of stuff out there, and what Asha loves to do, I mean, actually, I think we have similar tastes, so maybe it is the same, but usually what one person loves to do is not what another person loves to do, and that's fine. You just have to figure out what you love, and if you do, you're going to be really good at it. You're going to give it extra attention and effort, and that helps. And the other thing is you just have to be open to possibilities, because a lot of times, and this is certainly true in my case, the things you ended up doing were not necessarily what you thought, but you heard about it and you stopped long enough to think, wow, that actually could be amazing. And so don't think it's planned, it's not, but look for what you love.
What are two things? One more practical and one a little bit more meta. I think what I often see people going into nonprofits doing is to filter for cause, for the thing that they care about, the thing that they're passionate about. If they're passionate about climate change or hunger or whatever have you, and they choose an organization that is serving that mission, that means they're not filtering for the person they're going to be working for and the people they're going to be working with, advancement opportunities, professional development opportunities, right? All of the skill building, right? What's going to happen to me in this role? And so many end up in a toxic workplace, but feel like that's okay because they're serving this mission that they really care about. I say if you're first going into this, be entirely self-interested. Get yourself into a role that is going to advance you to the point that you have the power and then you can choose whatever mission you like. And the more meta piece of it is nobody needs to run a nonprofit to live a life of impact. And you don't even need to sit on a board. You don't even need to volunteer for a soup kitchen. You can make other people's lives better by the way that you act in whatever job you have every single day. You can choose to mentor your peers or your juniors. You can choose to extend a helping hand to colleagues. I could go on and on and on. We all know that not all workplaces have that kind of ethos. If yours doesn't, be the one to build that. And that's social impact.
I just add, I think you should be very suspicious of biographies because biographies are lies, right? Biography is the story of a life. That's how it translates. And you can read any of ours on this stage, and if you read the biography, none of them are the stories of our lives. They're the stories of our successes. They're the things which went well, which end up on a piece of paper. But there is a much longer set of paragraphs in all of our lives about the things that didn't go well, the mistakes that we made, the decisions we made that were wrong, those moments, and for me, those moments where I taught myself out of ideas. I say this as a person who enjoys extraordinary privilege in the world, and yet I constantly taught myself out of things I want to do. Over and over and over again, it happened twice this week. Ideas that I thought were interesting, and I somehow persuaded myself, it wasn't going to work, or I'll be embarrassed, or this wouldn't work, or someone else will think of it. That whole kind of cavalcade of ideas that talk you out of your own passions. And so I think there's something really important, which is you recognize that we all live very complicated lives, we all make mistakes, and we often don't tell the truth about, we talk about failure as a cool thing, right? Hey, I failed today, I'm enjoying failure, it's Failure Friday. People have fetishized failure, but failure is terrible, and it feels awful, and it happens, and we all screw up bits of our lives, personal and professional, and that's part of the story too. So I only say that because the danger of being on panels is you only talk about the things which have gone well. And so the people who listen assume that they too should have flawless lives. And I can promise you that every biography has 2 or more paragraphs, double of the successes in the failures that we don't talk about.
Yeah, appreciate that human note. All right. Questions from the audience? I think we have 2 mics on either side of the room. So if you can introduce yourself and just briefly, and a question, not a story statement, please.
Good evening, and thank you. I am a founder and director of a nonprofit here in New York City. It's called Latinas on the Verge of Excellence, and we support young women, but particularly young Latinas in public schools. I started this 13 years ago. And my question to Asha is, we've been doing Giving Tuesday every year. I paid attention when you talked about campaigns, and particularly campaigns that relate to culture and identity. One thing that I can share is that a lot of people resonate a lot with our mission. It's easy for us to recruit volunteers based on, supporting the community and all of this. We have tried very specific campaigns, but I don't feel that it goes as far as I think I would like in terms of obviously raising funding on Giving Tuesday, using the platforms that we use, social media. I don't know if there is any additional maybe advice that you may that you can share with me, that I can share with my team, to kind of bring in. We get a lot of young people, obviously, that are interested in our vision and our mission. So I don't know if there's any advice that I should do. Thank you.
A few things come to mind. I would recommend, there are large campaigns that center broadly around what you're doing, and joining in those efforts would get you a lot more visibility. So Hispanics in Philanthropy, for example, is a big partner of ours, and they really blow it out of the water every Giving Tuesday. I think the more creative you can get, the more you stand out from others who are doing more traditional fundraising campaigns. And just 2 things about Giving Tuesday that are really common misperceptions. It doesn't sound like you've fallen for either one of them. We hear about organizations sitting it out because of the noise. This is a day that people are literally looking for somewhere to give. Put yourself in their path. If you don't, you're definitely not going to make any money. If you do, you might make money. You might not, right? But you're definitely not if you don't try. And the other misconception is that smaller organizations, not that I'm assuming yours is small, but don't do well as big organizations with huge marketing budgets. And the thing to remember if you run a small nonprofit is you have the ability to be so much more agile. You're losing all of that top-heavy bureaucracy and those layers of approvals and the endless committee meetings. I feel like half the audience must resonate with that. And you can just get something out into the world, right, as an MVP, and really have fun with it.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Jacob McCam, a second-year student here at Columbia Business School. And I just want to thank you all for being here. The conversation's been extremely insightful. My question's specifically directed to you, Stuart. I guess how similar or dissimilar has your advisory role as an investor to your portfolio companies been compared to the advisory role you play in the nonprofit sector with the 92nd Street Y and other ventures you're a part of?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting because I've been on the board of some larger nonprofits now, and it's a lot more like fighting within a large bureaucracy all the time, right? It's like I've never sat on the board of IBM or General Motors. I've always sat on small entrepreneurial companies where you could push and get things done, where you could take risks, where you didn't have to sort of feel like you were working within a bureaucracy. And I definitely, every time I went to work like on the 92nd Street Y, and it was an amazing organization. And we were really able to bust through and create some entrepreneurship within the organization. But there's definitely a feeling of, we've been around for 130 years, we have a 60-person board, people have been on the board for 40 years, this is not the way it's been done, why would you change the way it's been done? And Henry knows in particular, when we tried to change the way it was done and do things differently, we got a lot of heat. It was not a lot of fun. We fought a lot of battles that we didn't really want to have to fight. So I do think that is one of the interesting things is when I think about nonprofits, right? Like Giving Tuesday is like a new, interesting nonprofit. But when you think about nonprofits that are the leading nonprofits, they've been around a long time. They have a certain way of doing things. They have people that have grown up in the organization. And it's just a lot harder to break through the noise there. But it's worth it.
Thank you so much for this wonderful event. It's been super interesting to hear perspectives, and I'm really curious to read the book now. When you were talking about fundraising earlier and mentioned the importance of being able to secure funds for a longer amount of time versus having to think about it all the time, I was thinking of Charity Water. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but I read the book like years ago, and I thought it was super interesting how they try to tackle this problem that people sometimes don't trust charities because they don't have the visibility of like, where does my money go? How much is used for administrative purposes? How much is actually going towards the cause I'm trying to support, by having the separation between like large wealthy individuals or like corporations and so on supporting the day-to-day work of the operations, and then sort of me, for instance, as an individual donating 100% of the money towards a specific project and having visibility on where that money goes, which I thought was like super interesting and a super innovative approach. I was wondering like how you approach that sort of for GivingTuesday when people donate, how they can track their impact, or how you approach sort of transparency and visibility to make sure that people trust the cause more and don't have this sort of fear that the money won't be spent in the right way.
Yeah, it's a little more complicated for us because we are an organization that doesn't take our own advice, in the sense that we do not have a broad, diversified base of everyday givers. We are only philanthropically supported by major foundations and high net worth individuals. There are really good reasons for that. We don't want to muddy the message because people still think that the money goes through us or that we take a cut of it, right? There's still that misperception out there, and so we really make an effort to not. We have no donate button on our website, it's hidden. We give it to somebody only if they ask, etc. So that's less of a complication for us. I think in general, I probably am in disagreement with some or all of the people on this panel, in the sense that I'm really bothered by the conversation as it exists around effectiveness in organizations. We really overstate, first of all, the lack of trust in nonprofits. Lilly Family School Philanthropy just came out with a study that indicated that the vast majority of Americans have a deep appreciation for the work of nonprofits. It's corporate institutions that they have a lower amount of trust in. But I think that when you look at a phrase like effectiveness, it's just problematic in the sense that the metrics that a nonprofit has to meet to be deemed effective were created by a very narrow range of people, and now we all have to live by them. Right? So if a few bros in Silicon Valley are going to declare, this is what I call an effective organization, I think we really need to push back against that. And particularly when I'm very biased because we work with so many hyperlocal organizations in the Global South, for example. They have no capacity to meet these Western imposed metrics. They're doing amazing work. Right? So I think that there is just a level, we talk a lot about the board trust of the leadership of a nonprofit, and I think there needs to be some trust in handing over your philanthropic dollars to an organization.
So this is such an interesting question, I can't resist offering a couple of thoughts. And I think I partly agree with you, and maybe in ways don't quite agree with you, but you'll see. So the first thing is, I do agree that there are conventional measures that are not really worth very much. And one of them is this concept of overhead. And why am I concerned about overhead? Two reasons. One is, if you look, there are some organizations out there that say they have virtually no overhead, no fundraising expenses at all, and yet they're raising a lot of money. And the question is, how do they do that? Well, they do it by classifying fundraising expenses as educational expenses, and then they put it in the mission. So the basic idea is you're not necessarily comparing apples to apples because people get creative in these categories. So that's one concern about it. Second concern is there are some things that just cost more. And I'll give you an example from my own professional life. So JDC does a lot of, I think, really wonderful work in the former Soviet Union. A lot of poor people in Moldova and Ukraine, they help them. Do a lot of important work for poor people in Israel too. But if you look at it, you will see that the overhead ratio in the former Soviet Union is higher than in Israel for two very simple reasons. One is the wage rates in the former Soviet Union are low, so program is cheaper. In Israel, it costs more, so more money into program. The second is, trying to think of a delicate way to put it, and maybe I won't be that delicate, you need to spend more on auditing in the former Soviet Union. Because let's just say that the governments there aren't necessarily as focused on or as effective at policing corruption, which means you have to do it yourself. Well, that's overhead, right? But does it mean that the social value of what JDC does in Israel is higher because we spend relatively more on program and relatively less on overhead? You might or might not come to that conclusion, but not because of overhead, which makes me agree with Asha about the bros declaring what we should be measuring, and that's a mistake. But my own personal view is that if you're managing correctly, and by managing I could mean a big organization and I could mean a really small organization, you got to define what you're trying to do. And once you've defined it, you should be measuring it. And then once you're measuring it, you have something to share. And so in my experience, one of the problems is funders will come in and say, show me this. And it's the wrong thing. My answer is, well, I know what you're trying to do, but actually I'd like to suggest that we show you this instead, because here are the 5 reasons why this is a better measure of what you want to know. Virtually every time I've had that conversation, people have said, oh, thank you, yeah, that sounds good. And then it's not wasteful or annoying, it's just bringing people into your process and helping them see what you do, and I think that's what we need to do.
Other questions? Oh, I see one in the front.
Okay.
Lady in the front.
My name is Pamela Nathanson. I'm an executive director of a nonprofit, global nonprofit, and I really appreciate a lot of the comments that Asha's making, and I hope that you're working on a book too, just to get some of these ideas out there, because I think there's some fundamental structural problems in the nonprofit sector. Been working in it my entire career for 25 years, and all the points are true. But the hydraulics are really complicated, and I think it's an interesting point, Stuart, that you're talking about the admirability of like the longevity of a nonprofit, because aren't we sort of doing this work to solve problems and be done with that and declare victory and move on instead of building large endowments to subsist and survive and keep doing the same stuff with sort of the the funds that we can raise each year? So I'm having that sort of realization at this stage of servicing nonprofits my whole career, and I just think that things are a little bit backwards. I think the funding has to show up to solve problems in different ways, rather than having the sort of doers or seers or visionaries have these great ideas, work really hard to come up with all the right impact metrics, raise all of the money, and keep doing that sort of year after year, decade after decade. So I don't know if anybody has thoughts on kind of any reimagining of like the funding hydraulics that should power solutions that aren't built into the nonprofit sector that we've architected in this kind of more of a sort of merry-go-round kind of a way.
I'll give you a perspective, which is, from the business world, right? We understand that some companies stick around for a long time, but there's a natural disruption to when new technologies or new circumstances change the market dynamics. I mean, nonprofits, well, here we're talking about luminary nonprofits, right? Nonprofits that have had long histories, et cetera. But the issue in the nonprofit sector is there's a ton of small, tiny organizations that never make that, crossing the chasm sort of, so to speak, of getting to that certain size. And I think there you'd see a lot more turnover, right, of nonprofits that start up and dissipate and, the funding dries up or whatever. I mean, that is something uniquely, I think, American. Can I say that as an Australian? Stuart, you can back me up. In that innovation is quite interesting in this market, in this country, versus other international markets where they think about philanthropy, where it's much more about, well, government should provide that, right? Isn't that government's solution to provide public education? That's not the sort of ethos so much in America, where philanthropy plays a much bigger role in coming up with innovative solutions. And in some ways it also reflects why philanthropy and nonprofits are a bigger maybe slice of the market in this country. but it also means innovation in the nonprofit sector is, I'm much more excited about what happens in this country than, say, I won't name it, but like in my home country, right, where it's much more, well, government should take care of that. I don't know if you all have a different perspective. I mean, you have an international perspective on this, Asha.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's a whole other conversation, surely. Yeah. But I think from what I hear you saying, I think there's a bunch of different things. I've never met a sector that loves its jargon like philanthropy, right? Like there's so many buzzwords that are flying around right now that like you can't go on a Zoom without hearing 30 of them. I have been on so many Zooms about reimagining philanthropy in the past year, let's say, 2 years. And I see some movement toward doing some of that reimagining, and sometimes not. And a board member of mine tells a story about being in a room full of foundation leaders that he convened, and all of them talking passionately about all the changes they needed to make in their methods of funding. And he said, at the end, he said, you know, you could all make a commitment to one thing that you're going to do differently. When you walk out of this room, silence. They were all like just kind of looking at each other and then left, and that was that. They had the conversation, right? So I think one of the things that's going to happen is there's going to be a leadership transition, right? There's going to be a leadership transition of our major foundations and our major nonprofits, and I think, you know, those leaders are going to come in thinking about things differently. And that may be when you see the actual change in the hydraulics, which is a great phrase.
Stephen Manzurs here, startup experience, and currently first year MBA student. Curious on how you guys shaped culture differently at GivingTuesday or other organizations as you grew. And, you know, I know you guys are fighting things differently on the top, but curious on how your hiring practices may have changed for the folks that are kind of helpers, your workers and whatnot. Curious if you instituted a culture differently to kind of run it like a startup, or maybe hired folks with different backgrounds to function maybe not specifically like a nonprofit, to function more like a startup. Curious on that.
Yeah, so we have 70 employees now, and they live in, I think, 19 countries and speak collectively 45 languages, including some I had never even heard of before we sourced that. So it's an incredibly global team, and that's really, when we talk about diversity, for GivingTuesday, that's really an important part of diversity, is lots and lots of lenses from different places. So that's one part of it. We've always been virtual, so we have to think about culture in really intentional ways, because we do have in-person touch points, but we can't afford to have a full 70-person staff retreat, let's say, for 3 days, right? So we have to find a lot of ways to make people feel connected. And I think one thing that really works for us is that every single staff member feels really deeply connected to the mission. And that's not enough, right? I think that's where some nonprofit leaders stop. Everybody feels really connected to the mission, so I can create a completely toxic workplace because everyone's so connected to the mission. So I think it's about creating spaces for people to become connected to each other as well. And certainly what Henry and Stuart said about prioritizing the mental, health of your staff and all of that, inserting ways to have fun, right, are really important. We have a lot of fun with each other as a staff, professional but warm and humorous, and I'm very privileged because I got to build my own nonprofit from scratch, right? I chose every board member I have. And I have the most incredible hiring pool in the entire world. I have an entire global community of amazing people. And I would say 3/4 of my staff, maybe 60%, are hired directly out of the GivingTuesday community. So they already come in knowing that they're committed and how unusual we are, right? That we're just not a normal model, and really just able to dive in and do the work. So that's sort of how I've approached that, and I belong to a lot of different communities. Like I have a community of women CEOs and a community of social sector infrastructure leaders, and we're very connected and always sharing ideas and information. And I think that part is really, really important, right? This sort of like Jack Welch model of CEO is so last century, right? And the model now is that you admit that you don't know everything, and you reach out to others for wisdom and advice and counsel and commiseration.
So I agree with all of that, and I'm just going to add one other piece, because who you hire is so important to shaping a culture. But frankly, and it's not pleasant to say, but who you fire can also be really important in shaping a culture, because it turns out you could have 9 terrific people in a group and one person who's less terrific, and that person might be complicating the dynamic, either by sapping morale, by creating resentment. This person doesn't, carry his or her weight and so on, or they're just getting in my way. And so I have to tell you, it's just never fun to have to do that, but on the other hand, the benefits can be enormous to the organization.
Last words, Henry or Stuart, about talent or people before we wrap up?
Self-evident, hire the best people and let them run, give them rope, let them hang themselves. Think that your job is to see if they succeed or fail, and if they fail, have to replace them. It's not to tell them what to do. If we could be better managers, we wouldn't be hiring managers.
The way you can become the best person in the world is Giving Tuesday is next Tuesday. So please make sure on Giving Tuesday you give deep and give to something which matters enormously in the world.
It's a great plug. Well, please join me in thanking our terrific panel. So thank you so much.